Hey folks, I'm Michael Tomasky, and this is the new Tomaskycast, except it is different from all other Tomaskycasts. Why is this Tomaskycast different from all other Tomaskycasts? I ask on this Jewish holiday, although not that Jewish holiday, because in this one, I'm going to be interviewed by my New Republic colleague, Tim Noah. Tim, what are you going to interview me about?
I'm going to interview you about your new book, Middle Out, which was published last month. And it's a subject that interests me quite a lot, middle out economics. And I actually have a forthcoming piece that engages some of the same issues. So I wanted to talk to you about your very good book, which I recommend highly.
Well, I thank you for your interest. And yeah, just to plug the magazine a bit, the current issue, the October issue, has an excerpt adaptation from the book by me. As Tim mentioned, the November issue will have a piece by Tim on similar things about what economics has gotten wrong in recent years. So this is something that we do a lot of at the New Republic. So that said, have at me.
All right. Well, let's talk first about the title, The Middle Out. It's about middle out economics. Can you explain to our viewers what is meant by middle out economics, where the phrase comes from, and so on?
Yeah, everybody's heard Joe Biden use it hundreds of times, but Joe Biden didn't coin it, and I didn't coin it. It was coined back in 2011 by Nick Hanauer and Eric Liu. Nick is a venture capitalist in Seattle who's a very progressive guy. People may have heard of him. He's written pieces for Democracy Journal, which I also edit, and for Politico and The Atlantic and New Republic. He's written a few pieces since I arrived at TNR about class economics and how horribly unequal our society has become and how that has to change. Eric Liu worked in the Clinton White House domestic policy and now runs a nonprofit that's devoted mainly to civics and citizenship kinds of issues. But they were writing together in 2011 about the need to change the economy and about the need specifically, Tim, to come up with a liberal narrative that would counter supply side economics. Supply side economics, of course, held that wealth will move down from trickle down. They didn't use that phrase, but liberals put that phrase on it, that if you give the rich tax cuts and give them more money, the wealth will trickle down to everybody else. A rising tide lifts all boats, as Ronald Reagan used to say. Hasn't worked out that way in empirical reality. But Nick and Eric were thinking of a metaphor for a different approach to economics that would counter trickle down, and middle out is what they came up with. You invest in the middle class and growth radiates out from there in all directions. So rather than giving the rich more money, you transfer wealth from the rich to the middle. And as long as you have a stable and secure and growing and thriving middle class, everybody will do well. That's the idea. 2011. So part of the point of the book is to tell this story of all this thought and action that's been going on in the last decade behind the scenes, I think, even to most pretty well-informed people, that has resulted in finally a Democratic administration casting aside a lot of the economic presumptions of the last several decades and trying to move in a new direction. Sorry, that was pretty long, but there you are.
It is an old idea. I think it's an old idea that we forgot about for a long time. Yeah. Barrington Moore, the sociologist at Harvard, famously said, "No middle class, no democracy."
Yeah.
And but we stopped worrying about the middle class for a long time. And as you point out, it wasn't just conservatives who embraced supply side economics. It was also the liberals who embraced freshwater economics, the version of neoclassical economics that predominated in Cambridge and MIT and Harvard and other places that were characteristically liberal. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, well, this goes back to the 70s, and there was a huge economic crisis in this country in the 70s. So as the book traces, after the crash, the great crash of 1929, when for the first time really in history, people began to question the primacy of the market and the ability of an unfettered free market to find its equilibrium. Keynes took over then. Roosevelt imposed Keynesianism, more public investment to goose demand, to drive employment. And Keynesianism seemed to work like a charm for 40 years. Eisenhower called himself a Keynesian, so did Richard Nixon. Then we had the OPEC oil crisis. Then we had raging inflation, then stagflation, which was a stagnant economy because of inflation and low employment and other factors. And that kicked open the door for a new set of ideas, for a new paradigm. And banging at that door since, in some sense, the late 40s, was a group of economists who called themselves neoliberals. And let's not get into the terminology. They based that on an older definition of the word liberal, but who said, see, your problem is all this government. You need to get the government out of the way and let the free market take over. And Jimmy Carter bought into some of that, deregulating the airlines, trucking industry, cutting capital gains taxes. Then Ronald Reagan really shoved it into overdrive. And it seemed to work at the very first, right? I mean, Reaganomics, it was really Paul Volcker who brought the United States out of that inflation era. But it was, in a way, morning in America in 1984 economically compared to what it had been. So it seemed to work, and they've been dining out on that ever since. Now, to get to the Democrats, I would say that the record of the two Democratic presidents of this era, Clinton and Obama, is a mixed record. I think they certainly made Keynesian moves. I think, Clinton's first budget imposed higher taxes on the rich and called for a vast level for that time of public investments. Obama did Obamacare. He did Dodd-Frank. He did a number of other things. So I don't think these guys were like relentless neoliberal stooges, although many people do these days. But they and their economic advisors and a lot of Democratic-leaning economists of that time, and you know this story better than I do, Tim. You could answer your own question probably better than I, but a lot of these Democratic economists of the time basically bought into neoliberal free market assumptions that the market was the best way to find a solution to social problems better than government. That, I think, was the key thing. Wouldn't you say something like that is the key sentence? The key
yeah. And, I think I would just add to that, it seems to me there was a lot of, it wasn't so much ideology, I think, as fear that inhibited Clinton and Obama. Here was this gigantic superstructure that was American finance, and people were telling them, if you tinker with it even a little bit, the whole thing is going to come crashing down because nobody really understands it. Yeah. And it was true that nobody really understood it, but nobody really thought either about the implications of that, which was if you didn't really understand how it worked, you really didn't know how to prevent it from crashing.
And and a lot of other things were happening simultaneous to all this, which was, in the political system was being eaten by money. Corporate lobbying was taking over the political system. There was no corporate lobbying to speak of in the 1960s. It started in the 70s and really hit stride in the 80s. So, the political system became awash in money. The campaign system became awash in money. Lobbying took over. In the broader culture, there was a celebration of wealth that just hadn't existed before, right? Remember Robin Leach, Life Stoils of the Rich and Famous. That was, I think that started in 1984. So all this stuff was going on. But yeah, at the level of economic policy making, a lot of Democrats just became, out of fear, deficit hawks. and afraid to do big government programs and terrified of proposing something without a way to pay for it. And the way to pay for most things is taxes, and they didn't want to do that. So they were caught in this spiral.
Right. And on the taxation point, I would say we're still caught in that spiral. I mean, it's still, Biden proposed a lot of progressive taxes, and almost none of them have gone through.
Yeah.
Which is still a problem.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the Great Recession and how that changed life in the, it's another one of those paradigm shifts like the 1973 oil crisis and stagflation. You have the next paradigm shift with the Great Recession. Tell us a little bit about what happened as a result.
Well, I say in the book that it was sort of a stillborn paradigm shift. And, by all rights, in other words, so crisis happened in 1929 that rendered Smithian laissez-faireism moot and weakened. Then a crisis happened in 1973, 74, 75 that rendered Keynesianism moot and weakened. Then Friedmanism took over. By all rights, the crisis of 2008, 2009 should have killed it off, but it didn't really. And it didn't really because there was no strongly articulated alternative vision waiting in the wings to take over, as there had been in the 1970s when the neoliberals had formulated their ideas and were just waiting for the right moment. In 2008 and 2009, on the liberal progressive side, there was still no consensus on what an alternative to neoliberal economics ought to be. There was a long-going debate in the Democratic Party and among liberals, with which you are every bit as familiar as I am, about what direction Democratic administrations ought to go. And this was caught very well in the early days of the Clinton administration, because he had some advisors who wanted to do more in terms of public investment, and he had other advisors who said, no, we've got to reassure the bond markets, we've got to bring the deficit down, and that's the first order of business. And so those debates have gone on in liberal circles for some time. The more conservative side somehow always won those debates.
Right, and I would add, I'm not sure Clinton was wrong wrong to worry about the bond markets in 1992. I'm inclined to think he was probably right about that.
Yeah, I say in the book, that, and I even quote, I have a footnote, it's not in the text, but Jeff Foe, who was very much an economic populist from the left, acknowledged that Clinton probably was right in an article he wrote in the American Prospect in the 2000s. So I wouldn't say Clinton was wrong, but I would say that it's just, the progressives were always outnumbered in the room.
Right.
But
you do see things changing, not at the governmental level, but at the grassroots level, and also in academia. You see pretty soon after 2009, in fact, I think it had begun a little bit before, a shifting in the emphasis in academic economics towards distributional questions, and a questioning of neoclassical economics as it had been practiced by liberals. And at the grassroots level, you saw Zuccotti Park. I was in the fall of 2011. I was finishing up a book about income inequality, which argued that this was a hugely important issue that nobody was paying attention to because it had happened so incrementally. And I literally had to go in and rewrite it in October 2011, because suddenly people were paying attention to income inequality. And they have continued to pay attention to it in the 11 years since. So I think that that movement had a huge impact.
Absolutely. And, the most interesting parts for my money of the book are chapters 6, 7, and 8, where I tell the story with some reporting about these changes in the economics profession, in the activist world, and in the very important but very undercovered foundation and think tank worlds, which have a lot to do with directing money into politics and deciding what are going to be policy priorities, and really behind the leadership of one guy in particular, Larry Kramer of the Hewlett Foundation, decided to put a lot of money into this search for a new economic paradigm. So in 2008, 2009, at the higher echelons of democratic policy thought and policy making, there was no consensus for an alternative vision. But that consensus arose, another phrase Joe Biden uses, from the bottom up, really. And it arose out of anger at not aggressive enough a response to the Great Meltdown. And it arose in Zuccotti Park with Occupy Wall Street, which fizzled out after a fairly short time. But I think that the impact of that movement has been much more dramatic than it seemed in real time. Then there was the Fight for 15. That's about the minimum wage. I remember the very day that started. I'm sure you do too. It started from when hundreds of workers at hundreds of fast food outlets in Manhattan staged a one-day walkout, a dramatic day, and it led to a lot of stuff. The minimum wage has not been increased at the federal level. It's tragic to say, but all kinds of states and localities and municipalities have raised their minimum wages. All kinds of companies have raised it of their own volition, so that people are now starting at $15 or $17 or $19 at a number of companies. So the government hasn't caught up with that, but that is happening, and that Fight for 15 had a very big impact. A whole lot of other things that I catalog in the book, some directly economic, some not, some having to do with racial justice, and racial equity is also a really important part of this story, because we look back fondly to the New Deal and to the glorious 30 years from 1945 to 1975 as a time of greater income equality, better economic values, and all that's true. And I say that in the book, but we shouldn't look back completely fondly at that period, because that was a period of intense racism and sexism, and women and Black people weren't included in that economic project in a way that they need to be now. So all these movements of the teens really, began to snowball, and then you have Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, and
let's stop and talk about Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, because they are transformational figures, really. And I think Sanders's role came as a particular surprise to a lot of us who've been watching Sanders for years. I did a Wall Street Journal profile of Sanders when he first ran in 1990 for the House.
Yeah.
And he was kind of a colorful feature story. And a lot of people treated him as a colorful feature story. But he has grown into something more. He's a political force. I think it's doubtful he'll ever become president, but he has certainly changed our politics, and he has certainly changed President Joe Biden's politics. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. No, he really has. So to start with Warren, because she came on the scene, well, he was in the Senate before she was, of course, but she burst onto the scene in a way in 2010, 2012, that was really quite dramatic, and that really shifted the landscape at a time when Sanders was still not a very prominent figure on the national stage. And she was, and she her tussles with Tim Geithner that I'm sure people watching this know all about, and the way she was able to articulate a liberal frustration with the economic reigning realities of the day. Like that one viral video she had where, if you build a business, that's great, good for you. You keep most of it, but you pay some of it back to future generations. That's what we do in this country. So there was that moment and others. She stopped Larry Summers from becoming Fed chair when she was new to the Senate. So she changed a lot. And then comes Sanders in 2016. And I say in the book, I was pretty critical of Sanders in 2016. I didn't think, well, and I still don't think, to be honest, that he could have won a presidential general election. But I'll say this: I was totally wrong in that I underestimated the reach of his message and the resonance of his message. I missed it, and particularly among young people, but all over the country. I mean, there are politicians who run for president who just choke and who just show that they don't have the chops to be on a national stage, and they can't handle the pressure and the spotlight and the heat. But he rose to his historical occasion.
And it's wild that he did, because I remember, I think it was in 2020, my wife and I went to see him speak. We were in Austin, and he was having a rally, a short walk away. So we walked over to watch it. And what really struck me watching him was that it was the same Bernie you saw when you talked to him. And that isn't a compliment. He was not charismatic. He was somewhat hectoring. He did not seem to have any particular magic about him. He had no emotional appeal to the audience. It seemed that it was simply his message that was absolutely electrifying audiences.
Yeah, he was just saying things that millions of people were obviously desperate to hear some national politician say, and that most Democrats had been too cautious to say for a long, long time. So, in retrospect, I give him enormous credit, and, I quibble with him on this policy or that policy, but, the fact that a $15 minimum wage is now just a standard assumption among 99% of Democrats is obviously a great thing. And the idea that healthcare is a right, whether is obviously a great thing. So his influence has been pretty terrific.
And particularly, since became the chairman of the Senate Budget Committee, I think he has really become a force in Washington in the Biden administration.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the COVID epidemic. What role did that have in advance? That's another sort of smaller paradigm shift, but tell us about what impact that had.
Yeah, well, it was in keeping with this idea that change only happens when crises occur. That was a big deal, COVID. I think it opened the door for a lot more people to be receptive to government intervention in a way that they hadn't been before. What's that phrase about being in a foxhole? Everybody finds religion in a foxhole.
There are no atheists in foxholes, right?
Yeah, right. Well, in a severe and real financial crisis, everybody's a Keynesian, right? And Donald Trump signed a bigger pandemic relief bill than Joe Biden did by $400 billion, right? 2.3 trillion to 1.9 trillion. And all the Republicans voted for it. Of course, they're fine voting for it when a Republican president proposes it. So I think, I say in the book, and I don't know if I'm right about this, but even with all the changes of the teams, from Occupy Wall Street to the Sanders campaign to AOC to all the rest of it, I don't know that the door would have flung open for more government spending if the pandemic hadn't happened, because the pandemic just created a real crisis that people needed money now, and it made Biden change his way of thinking too, right? I mean, that's the important part of it, because before that, he was essentially saying, if we can just go back to the way things were before Donald Trump, everything will be fine. Then comes the pandemic, and suddenly he's saying, this is my FDR moment.
And what's amazing about COVID is it was a terrible event in our history. It killed a lot of people. I think more than 1 million at this point. But we all believed that it was going to wreck the world economy and the United States economy, and that it did not do. And it didn't do that, I think, in large part because of the actions that you're describing.
Yeah, I think so. So, as the proprietor of these casts, let's go about 10 more minutes, okay?
Okay. Let's talk, let's get down to specifics. One kind of middle out economics study that I'm very interested in is the study that David Card and Alan Kruger did in the early 90s on the minimum wage. You make a point in your book that actually had never occurred to me, which is that one of the things that happened was driven by technology. Technology made available in the early 90s a lot of data, a lot of empirical evidence that wasn't available before. And that allowed economics to move out of the realm of theory much more into the realm of reality and documented experience. The Card and Kruger study was a real landmark there. Can you talk about it a little?
Yeah, it was seminal. In 1992, New Jersey raised its minimum wage. And as it did so, there emanated the usual howls from the usual quarters that this is going to be a job killer and that it's going to crush the economy of New Jersey and send unemployment through the roof. So Card and Kruger in 1992 and 93, I suppose, probably after it kicked in, studied wages and jobs in establishments along the New Jersey-Pennsylvania border. So they looked at the actual data. They didn't do theoretical modeling, which was more au courant at the time in economics, but they went and studied the data. They did what they call in the jargon of economics a natural experiment, and they found that the assumptions of neoclassical economics and the critics of the Chamber of Commerce types were wrong. That New Jersey employment had not gone down as a result of New Jersey raising this minimum wage. And that was really new, and a lot of people didn't want to accept that. A lot of people still don't accept that. Republican politicians certainly still don't accept it. But it has been borne out again and again and again as localities have raised their minimum wages. And not only has it not killed employment, it's helped the local economy. It's helped businesses. Seattle restaurants, gloom and doom was predicted for Seattle restaurants when Seattle raised its minimum wage. Seattle restaurants have been fine. This was all before the pandemic, which has had its own impact, but Seattle restaurant business was fine. Maybe partly because more people could afford to go out and eat at restaurants because they were making more money, right? So that's a very key aspect actually of middle out economics, which just, turns so many assumptions of classical and neoclassical economics on their head.
Or I would say it doesn't necessarily have to overturn assumptions. It can simply introduce new variables that nobody had thought about before.
Yeah.
One can still imagine a circumstance where raising the minimum wage would reduce employment, but what the neoclassical economists never considered were how that weighed against other factors like more stability in a workplace. And when you have more stability, you have more productivity, or simply the sort of psychological effect on the people working for more pay. Yeah. These were just sort of variables that had been invisible before.
I'll give you what I think is the most prominent and important one, which I go into at some length in the book. The idea of how wages are set. classical economic theory has wages being set by a set of impersonal market factors that have to do with the supply of labor and the demand for it, and so on and so forth. And there's a name for it, the wage theory of determination. More recently, a lot of economists, notably Joe Stiglitz, but many others, have begun to recognize that something else helps determine wages: the political power of the workers. Workers have the power to, and this is something that I've heard Nick Hanauer say 100 times, workers earn what they have the political power to earn, period. And that's it. It's not market forces that set wages. It's political power. Economics has become more open to this idea, and it's a big breakthrough to see that for economists to see that politics matters. It's a big deal.
And it's shocking, frankly, to me that economists didn't notice it before, because it was staring you in the face.
Right.
What happened over the last 50 years? The union movement collapsed.
Yeah.
I think sometimes I think that economists need to understand. Any student of politics understands that if you have an interest group that loses power, then its influence will decline, and it will get less out of the federal government and out of the private sector. And that's exactly what happened to labor.
Right.
But economists really, that was that delusion that they really didn't want to factor in government actions. They wanted to think that the market operated by its own mechanisms that were entirely independent of anything the government would do. The only thing the government could do, and there were liberals who believed this also, the only thing government could do was spoil it.
Yeah. Yep. So, that's been a big change, and there are a number of other changes along these lines. But, the bottom line is that, the economics profession is catching up to the reality of how the world works.
Let's talk about democracy and economics, because you talk about how we can't assume that they are linked. We used to assume that they were linked. There was this whole notion of free minds, free markets, they go together. And we sort of we got our first inkling that didn't always happen in China when the Tiananmen Square protests occurred. And I remember seeing Winston Lord, a former Kissinger aide, on television at the time, calling the crackdown at Tiananmen Square well, he had a slight speech impediment, so he called it a Pyrrhic victory, a Pyrrhic victory. And it wasn't a Pyrrhic victory, it was an absolute victory. They squelched the democracy movement, and they continued to be wildly successful capitalists. It absolutely scrambled our understanding of how the world works. Can you elaborate?
Well, Milton Friedman wrote in Capitalism and Freedom in 1962. I believe the very first paragraph of the book makes this link and says that, in essence, democracy can flourish only in capitalist societies where the market is unfettered, and that once you start to clamp down on economic freedoms, a clamping down on democratic freedoms is inevitable, and you're going to have collectivism and an unfree state, a police state. And many people bought this, and many people literally bought the book, but many people bought the idea. And it is still conventional wisdom for vast numbers of people in this country and in our political system. It's not true, and it never has been true. And I document this in the book. There are a number of societies in this country, in this world, a number of nations where they are capitalist societies, but they clamp down on democratic freedoms. Now, it's a very common thing, and it doesn't stand to reason at all that that regulation and government intervention in the economy lead to a diminution of political and democratic freedoms. There's very little correlation. If there were any correlation to that, the Scandinavian nations, which are economic basket case or political, economic basket cases by Milton Friedman's lights, right? I mean, they're social democracies where there's huge government spending as a percentage of GDP. Well, those should all be police states. They're not. Personal freedom is actually higher in those countries than it is in the United States, according to the World Population Review. I also cite, to me, the humorous example of swinging London in the mid-1960s. They elected a socialist prime minister in 1964. He nationalized the steel industry and he did all kinds of other things. But this was like the great explosion of personal freedom, and one of the great explosions of personal freedom in the history of the 20th century. So there is no such correlation. The real correlation is that concentration of wealth and power at the top hurts democracy and diminishes democracy. That's the real correlation. And that's not a Bernie Sanders notion or an AOC notion or even a Franklin Roosevelt notion. Thomas Jefferson believed that. James Madison believed that. John Adams believed that. They all believed that if America followed the economic example of Britain with its great landed estates and complete immiseration of working and working people and farmers, that democracy wouldn't survive. That America.
And that's why it's so disappointing that the part of Biden's agenda that has had the least amount of success among Democrats in Congress has been his attempts to limit the reach of inherited wealth.
Yeah. Well, people are still working with these old assumptions that are very hardwired in their brains. That's why every Democrat in Congress needs to read the middle out and figure out that the reality needs to be different.
Let's wrap it up just by talking about freedom. You talk about how the Democrats need to emphasize freedom, talk about it in the way that FDR talked about it, which was as not as negative freedoms, but as affirmative freedoms. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, well, again, to go back to Milton Friedman, he and his cohort and Republicans today, conservatives today, have convinced people that freedom means the free market. That if we have a free market, everybody's free. Well, I grew up in West Virginia. I can drive people around a lot of towns where the free market has not made people very free. There's jobs are gone, opportunities gone, and not just in West Virginia, obviously, but all over this country. So there's a lot of freedom for the 1%. There's a lot of freedom for the 5%, maybe even the 10%. But an average working person making $40,000 a year, I doubt they feel very free.
As Chris Christopherson said, freedom's just another word for nothing left to lose. Right?
Precisely. So I conclude the book by talking about economics, democracy, and freedom, saying they're not liberals. Democrats tend to treat these things as separate. They're not separate. They're all one argument. A more just economy makes for a healthier democracy, and it increases people's freedom. Democrats need to talk about this. They just need to redefine the word freedom, not as the free market or freedom from intrusion by the state, like we're going to come take your guns, but freedom too. There are two kinds of freedoms, as you suggested in your question. There's freedom from this sort of some sort of intrusion, but freedom to live up to your fullest potential as a human being, freedom to have health care, freedom to make a decent wage, freedom to not live under the reign of monopoly power, which we haven't talked about, but which I write about in the book and is sort of a mini obsession of mine. And people don't know this, but monopoly arrangements add a few $1,000s a year to the cost of people's lives every year. So there are freedoms, those are freedoms. Freedom to live a different kind of life. And to me, it sounds like a winning formula. I mean, I'm not a pollster or a focus group person, and I don't go, to campaign in purple suburbs where people are skeptical of me. So I don't, but it sounds to me like a winning argument. I mean, nobody doesn't like those words, democracy and freedom. Everybody likes those words. And Democrats have given the word freedom to Republicans for 50 years. So,
actually, your I was going to just say your predecessor, Herbert Crowley, a founder of the New Republic, was a kind of a seminal thinker in this idea that democracy and freedom was not freedom from government, but freedom granted by the government to do certain things.
Yeah. So I'd love to see Biden specifically articulate that if indeed he runs next time. So there we are. That's the book.
All right. Well, thank you. This has been a great conversation.
A lot of fun. Thanks for doing it.
Mm-hmm.